All right, hey everyone. It is October 21, and this is Service API's office hours. Happy Wednesday, everyone. I think we're making some good progress here. We've had a couple interesting discussions come up over the past week that I think will be great to discuss here on this meeting. But before we get there, I want to take a quick couple minutes to go through our V1 Alpha 1 milestone. We keep on getting ever closer to being complete here. Trying to find anything that is new here. I believe this is relatively in order, which means the last two that we haven't discussed yet are these two: gateway listeners default for hostname match. Maybe Harry, do you want to give a little bit of background on this one?
Yeah, so I think the issue here is what is this issue I'm trying to recall? Yeah, so you have if you scroll down into the YAML block, we have host name of match type any, and if you have like TCP or any other protocol which does not have the concept of host name, then that confuses users. Now, James pointed out, and that's right, that the documentation says that, the match type of any means, it also includes cases where you do not need to match based on host name, which is which I think is like, I mean, technically that is right, but and you don't need to include the host name field. It defaults to that. But even after defaults are injected, this is a little confusing. So I was hoping if James is not on the call. So we are having a discussion around here. If you scroll down, Rob. Um, so you can see hostname match any specifies that this listener accepts all client traffic regardless of the presence or the value of any host name supplied by the client. Um, so I think this is where we are getting into this interesting territory that Rob, the last time you mentioned, where maybe the controller internally, has a default. And I think James is pointing that out here as well.
Yeah, that's where I would lean as well. The whole idea that although this isn't technically wrong, it feels unnecessary for a gateway that is, using TCP protocol. You'd rather not see that in your spec at all. And based on that, I think it may be better to infer this behavior from the absence of a host name field being set in a listener than to actually set that default.
So what you're saying is that the behavior should be that if the hostname field is empty, then it should be match any.
Yeah,
because then you can use emit empty. Then you can use emit empty to ensure that it doesn't show up if it's not set.
Yeah. So it's very similar to what we already have. It's just not setting a default and instead inferring that default.
So the any default is. I'm not necessarily saying I agree. I'm just saying that that's what you're saying, and it does.
That is what.
In this case, it does make sense that the config is not actually relevant at all. So it would make more sense for it not to be visible from looking at the YAML point of view. So James, I talked over you there. Sorry.
That's okay. I was just going to say, I don't really see that this is different to any of the other places where we default things. I think the nice thing about being able to make defaults is that the configuration is explicit. And so you can see here, when I made a TCP protocol thing, and I didn't specify the host name, it's going to match any host name. And so it whacks you over the head with what the default actually is. So you can see it.
Would another option be, since hostname is irrelevant for layer 4 load balancing? I see that we have exact, we've got domain and any. what if we added an additional hostname match type of none that would be used for TCP route or any layer 4 protocols that essentially don't do any hostname matching?
You
I
just
think
net the
that-
same thing.
I think that
It
could
is-
get confused. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just about to say, I think it is the same thing. It's just it's a syntactic sugar style name, but I agree that, yeah, yeah. Go.
So what I was going to say here is, to me, hostname feels irrelevant here. And if it's, so I agree with what James is saying. We're using defaults all over the place, and those defaults make it clear that when you haven't specified anything, this is what's happening. And I like the use of defaults wherever that's the case. But in this case, you know, like L4 protocols where hostname is not entirely relevant, it feels like we're actually saying something that doesn't even matter. And that feels less than ideal here. If we could default for specific protocols only, that would make this feel a lot better. But because we have to default for all or nothing, I would rather only set this field or only default this field so it shows up in the manifest no times, because we have this L4 weirdness where it just, to me, it feels unnecessary and potentially confusing.
Sure, but if I change the protocol to HTTP, I can make exactly the same argument and reach a different conclusion, right?
Because for HTTP, you want it to default to hostname match any, and you want it to be present, and you want it to tell you that it's matching any. You want not to have to infer that from the fact that there is no hostname match. Is that what you're saying, James?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for expanding my shorthand, Nick. That's exactly what I'm saying. So I think I agree with you. It's a little bit verbose, but I just kind of struggle to think that it's I don't know. It doesn't seem that.
It feels to me like it comes down to which case is going to be more common, right? Like which is going to impact, which is going to be confusing for more people. The fact that TCP has a hostname match any when it's not really relevant, or if we change it so that the default for hostname is nothing and it's not present, and you create a HTTP route and you don't have anything saying this will match on any hostname. Like which one is more confusing, I guess, is the question then. Because those are the two options, right? Like either we have a default that is a non-empty default, in which case everything will show up, or we don't, and we have a default that is the empty value, in which case you can have a mid empty and it will not show up. Those are the two options. One of them is confusing for TCP route, and one of them arguably is confusing for HTTP route. So I guess, Harry, you raised the issue. Back to you.
I mean, wait, do we not have the third option of match type none?
It's good, but then
But to me, I would interpret a match type of none as potentially even more confusing. You know, one way to interpret match type none means match no host names at all, which, you know, seems stupid, but you could interpret it that way. To me, match type none seems very similar to match type any, at least in terms of how we would interpret it.
I see. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I get that argument too. I mean, I'm fine leaving this the way it is. I just wanted to make sure that we are doing this and we are okay with this API. This is definitely a little confusing to me, but
Yeah.
it's not something that, you know, I'm like, no, we have to absolutely fix this. So.
Yeah, I guess. So how about I will go there now and I will put a thing in there saying, you know, here's my feelings on we've got two options. We can either leave the defaulting in place and have confusion on the TCP case, or we can set it so that the default is empty, which will be much easier to understand, which I agree is easier to understand in the TCP case, but that will then produce some slightly magic behavior in the HTTP route case.
Yeah, that magic behavior is going to confuse more people.
Yeah, so
what I'm like,
that's-
because we know HTTP is going to be more common. So.
Yeah, so
So-
that's my gut feeling too. But I'll write it out there, and then we can agree on the ticket. That's why we're doing it this way.
Because
Now,
I think the
to
nice thing about
clarify-
defaults is that you don't have to, kind of hurdle the ingress controllers into doing the same thing in the absence of a field, right? Because you never encounter that situation.
Hey, Rob, can you do a refresh on this and then scroll down to an example that I added just to. So if we're saying that the hostname matching is not applicable across all protocol types, I mean, what if we did a little refactoring and we say, okay, get rid of the hostname matching at the listener level and kind of expand what protocol is. And we say, okay, well, the protocol, what type, and what kind of hostname matching, and what we can do potentially with the protocol is maybe even default to type HTTP and hostname match any, but hostname match can be ignored, optional if the type is TCP, for example.
And just to surface Bowie's comments from chat, I think he's pointing out that HTTP pointing to TCP route.
Oh, yeah, let me update. Sorry, let me update. I was trying to do it really quick while we're
impressive to get this out there in such a short time. I think
also,
this is an
there's
interesting.
also the hostname field inside there, right? Like hostname has two fields. One is match and one is name. The name is omitted in the example I opened in the issue, but the name issue is what it's the domain or the exact match. So it's like
yeah. Again, I was trying to do this quick, but yeah, I know exactly what you're saying. So let me just make one other revision to it then.
So I wanted to suggest maybe this really should be a union discriminator type, and I think that's kind of what Dane's proposal gets at.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yep.
So just to kind of point in the other direction a little bit, when we've run into any kind of controversy over defaulting fields, so far the stance we've taken, admittedly there's not a ton of prior art here, but we've leaned towards not setting a default because and again, we are going to make breaking changes. This is an alpha API. But it is always easier to add a default than to remove a default. So if we're unsure, and if we're close to a V1 Alpha 1 launch, I would lean towards not including the default at this point, simply because it's always going to be easier to add it later.
But you're not actually changing the default. What you're doing is you're moving the default from being explicit in the YAML to being implicit in the ingress controller.
Yeah, that's correct. But so to me, this does feel somewhat different though, because the absence of specifying, to me, the way I interpret this API, if you don't specify host names, it's reasonable to assume match any host name. And if you do specify host names, it's reasonable to assume just match the host names I specified. That seems like it seems like a way to further filter what is being matched here. But not something like that is, if it doesn't exist, just match anything seems like a reasonable interpretation.
That kind of makes sense to me, I guess, that if you don't specify a match, then you don't care about what it is. I understand the point you're making, James, about the fact that then it's kind of down to the controllers about what they do, but like I do feel like you're adding a match condition on the host name, right? Like if you specify a host name, and depending on from what I remember of this bit, it looks like you can do exact or wildcard or something like that, and then the field is just about telling you what should be in the field, and so yeah, just having it. I think I can't. I guess I'm taking a very long time to say that I think I agree with Rob.
I guess I don't have a super. I mean, I don't know. This isn't the end of the world if you take it out. But my preference is for defaults to be explicit when we can make them, and I don't see this as a special case.
Yeah, that makes sense. I need to think about this more myself. I appreciate everyone who's already added comments here. I have missed this conversation so far, so I will follow up here as well. And maybe we can have a bit more conversation on this issue and follow up tomorrow. And hopefully we'll have some consensus. But I agree with what James is saying as well, that I think there's, a reasonable case to be made with either decision here. And I'm not going to be terribly upset if it's, if there is a default here or if there isn't. But right now, my preference leans towards not setting a default. Yeah. Do we have any more comments on this before we move on? Okay, I'll keep on running then. Again, that's issue 403. If anyone wants to, very memorable issue number, if anyone wants to continue that discussion. Okay, so the other one is just a follow-up issue. I created this, we removed, we've had lots of discussions around this. We removed allowed gateway namespaces, at least for now, in favor of other options. And the argument was that for now, we should provide examples of how you use policy tools like Gatekeeper to enforce this instead. And this is just a tracking issue to actually add those examples. Does anyone happen to have much experience with Gatekeeper where this would be something like they could help out with?
I am a volunteer, James.
I was going to volunteer someone else. I'm personally not going to volunteer, but I mean, it's not that hard for people to deal with Gatekeeper. The documentation is pretty good.
Okay. Cool. Well, if I do take this one on, I may run some questions by you then, James. Yeah. Cool. All right, that's all that we have new in the milestone. We've also closed a lot of things in the milestone over the past week. So thank you to everyone for your contributions. We are legitimately getting closer. With that said, we've got plenty more to discuss here, and I want to make sure we have time for it. Yes, right off, top of the line is an issue that generated a lot of discussion. And I know we've gone back and forth on this, and we've said some things that suggest that gateway merging should not happen, but apparently we don't quite have consensus on exactly what that should look like. So I guess, Harry, you started this discussion. Do you have any background here?
Yeah, so before we start, I mean, I expected this to be a little controversial, or rather folks not to have consensus on it. So this is expected, but this came up, like Micaiah pointed out during a conversation, should gateway merging be allowed or not, right? And we, in the conversation said, it should not be allowed. Then I went back, thought about the cases where, ingress resource merging was being done. And then I think, who was that? I think it was Nick, or I think it's Nick and down in the thread below who points out, we now allow to set TLS certificates on the HTTP route level. So which was one of the main reasons to do gateway merging. So but that case is already solved now. So yeah, I mean.
So I think it was Micaiah actually who pointed that out. But I think I made the converse point that the that if we do that, then it kind of messes with the people who don't want to allow anybody, who want to explicitly stop people from being able to add any cert they want to the thing a little bit. So, I mean, maybe we do that another way, but that was my initial concern when I read this.
Yeah, there's two separate use cases, right? So I think what I was curious with this one is why would we, I think I'd like to understand the background of why we would want to be prescriptive to implementations at all in this area.
So my understanding of the issue here is that there are potential ramifications here for conflict resolution, and they just conveniently go away when we're not doing gateway merging. And you know, the idea is, well, hey, if you just have a whole bunch of listeners, isn't that equivalent to several gateways with those listeners, you know, split across them? So with this new listener abstraction that we have, relatively new, does that solve gateway merging? To clarify, I'm not arguing in favor of that. That's just my understanding of why we would want to be prescriptive here.
Yeah, I'd like to, one thing that just came to mind is, do we have a very concrete idea of what merging is? Because you can imagine that you're not merging, but you have some kind of constraints where people are creating gateways and they kind of get rejected because you just can't host them. Is that, and then part of that may be that you end up having to merge it together as part of your implementation, but you might have other constraints that have very similar effects with multiple gateways.
I didn't get much of that personally. I don't know about anyone else.
Yeah, it was tough to understand. Sorry, go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, so that's all I was saying. Yeah, sorry, Bowie. Your audio is really choppy.
Let me.
What are the use cases that do require the gateway merging?
So one of the use cases, I think John pointed this out down here, is that they have users with thousands of domains and, you know, huge amounts of namespaces. And although you theoretically could accomplish some of this if you had just a massive gateway object, that might not be easy to use. And certainly at the scale of 10,000 domains, it's probably not even possible. So for that specific use case, it may be an edge case, but it is something that, you know, does run up against the scalability limits that we would impose by not supporting any kind of gateway merging.
Oh, hello. Sorry, is it working now?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's much better.
Okay. Yeah, my question was, do we have a sense of what merging means? Because I can imagine you have infrastructure where, due to various things like a set of multiple gateways can't be created because it violates some kind of shared resource. But that's like a property of the implementation, rather than saying there's a specific way that if you are going to merge, it's done such that, you know, it has these constraints, so on and so forth. Like, how do we distinguish between that case and the preventing merging case?
Right, I think that's exactly the point, right? If you don't define, like, we don't really know what merging means for an implementation. So if we don't know what it means, then it's hard to argue that it shouldn't be allowed.
So the counter argument to that, I think, is if we don't know what merging means and we leave it open to gateway merging, we're leaving ourselves up to, you know, 10 different implementations, implementing gateway merging 10 different ways and losing any kind of sense of portability for that part of this API.
But that's the point of and that's kind of the goal, right? Is that different implementations will be able to do different things. If you wanted to specify how the implementation works, then, you know, we should probably build an implementation.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think
that's fair.
It's a subtle distinction, Rob, because we could talk about if you cannot satisfy the request, irrespective of the reason, how that would be presented to the user. And that, in my mind, is where we should be very specific here. But some implementations may be able to do things in the merge case that others cannot. And that one seems harder to me, unless we are literally talking about like a specific way to implement it.
Yeah, what I've been focused on and what I'm saying is like the conflict resolution aspect of this. You merge two gateways that have listeners that are nearly identical. Which one do you choose? And implementation Y chooses this one, and implementation X chooses this one. And
yeah, I think like maybe we should focus on like if you had to reject a gateway because it has an underlying shared conflict, then like what the behavior would be. So I can give you an example. Like, for example, you have a pool of IPs, and then you start stuffing the gateways into this pool of IPs. Eventually you run out because it's a fixed pool. So like you may have to merge some of them, but the way you merged it is not like, there could be many ways that you have done that.
It sounds like the important part then for the, and I'm making air quotes when I say it, conflict resolution is, how you surface the conflict, the information about the conflict. Like we're in any of the cases that we've talked about there, the important part is how do you, like, we need to be very, maybe we don't have to be prescriptive about what merging means and how you merge, but we do need to be prescriptive about what you put in the status to tell the end user that something went wrong. And that there needs to be specific things to say, specific ways that you say there was a you tried to merge this and there was a conflict or something like that. That there are very clear ways for the API to say, this ingress class expects to merge gateways, or this gateway class, expects to merge gateways, and I couldn't merge them for some reason. There needs to be a very clear way to say that is implementation independent, so that across implementations you can always be sure that there is a straightforward way to know that that's happened, if you see what I'm saying.
Yeah, and I think we've tried to address that with the condition vocabulary. So by trying to have standard types and reasons. So I have to check. I'm not sure we have a reason for conflicts across gateways. We definitely do have reasons that cover conflicts within gateways.
Yeah, maybe a good next step here would be to do a follow-up PR that just adds conditions for what for conflicts merging gateways, because I agree. I'm pretty sure we don't have that specific thing covered yet in our in our condition vocabulary. But that may be the best thing we can do at this point to cover merging.
Well, I like the way that Nick put it on this issue, or this PR, which is that conceptually, the implementation is merging a bunch of gateways and then doing the validation. And if you look at it that way, we already have a way of saying a listener has a conflict, and we have a few reasons that would apply, host name, protocol, or route conflict. So I'm not sure we need a specific reason for, it was a host name conflict resulting from merging multiple gateways.
Yeah, it comes down then to the detailed reason, probably. In the detailed reason, you need a way to say there was a conflict between the listener from this gateway and the conflict from the listener from this gateway, just so that there's a discoverable way for a person who's looking at this to figure out which is the one to do it. I would say most things that are going to do merging are probably going to want to, are going to have different opinions about whether they pick one, whichever one's first, or if they pick one, which one they pick, or they reject both, or something like that. But both of those things have pros and cons. But you need to have some way to signal, I picked this one. There was a conflict and I picked this one, or there was a conflict and I rejected them both, or here's the reference to the other one that caused the conflict.
Well, we have with HTTP routes, we already have addressed this issue, and in the API documentation, we refer to the principles around conflict resolution, which we lay out in the concepts document. I think that would suffice in this case. We can add a reference for listeners or for gateways. If a conflict arises during merging, you should follow those same principles in the concepts document.
Yeah, I haven't seen that for a while, but that sounds like it makes sense to me.
Yeah, I agree with that. Harry, since you started this conversation, how do you feel about where we're heading right now?
Yeah, I think I'm not too concerned about conflict resolution. I think that can be resolved as we are already talking about. That's not the big problem. I think to me, couple concerns, right? The first concern is, will this change, make users abuse gateway resource as an in-case resource? And what if, like, people are merging 10,000 gateway resources instead of, have like organizing it a separate way. And then, I still don't understand the use cases, like a proper use case behind it yet. So that's my limitation there. And the second is, I think we always talk about, like, we don't have to be prescriptive of implementation at all. And I sort of disagree there, because when we talk about portability, it's not just about, portability of the API or how you define policies, right? Like here we do. It's also about the end result, right? Like the end user should be able to move across implementation if that is what we really want. We need to have some contract with how it actually gets implemented. Otherwise it becomes too vague and too broad of an abstraction to actually meaningfully satisfy.
I think that's a fair point. That yeah, like, I mean, we got to have opinions about something, right? Like, if I was brutally summarizing what you just said, Harry, and it kind of does make sense. Yeah, we need to have opinions about some things to do with the thing, and we need to be able to say, your implementation needs to be bounded in some ways. I think that it's probably fair that we need to talk more about the use cases that would be here. Again, I suspect that the use cases that are going to cause problems if we don't have some sort of gateway merging are ones where you want to allow people to specify some set of domain names, for example, for HTTP routes, but you want to not allow the specification of arbitrary domain names and routes and stuff like that. Something like that. Like, I need to think more about it. Again, I'm catching up because it's been a while since I was involved, but I mean, maybe a better place for that is the HTTP route, and you service this information there. But I think John's point is fair that if you've got a lot of domains and you've got a lot of and they all need TLS details or something, like it does. You've got to put them somewhere, and being able to specify stuff about those domains in a central place is nice. And it feels like a lot of the stuff that we have in Gateway, you're going to either be using the gateway, or you're going to be duplicating a lot of the information that's in the gateway. Because if you do want to not say, hey, accept anything, which kind of having just using the HTTP route thing is, then you're kind of stuck. So I think that feels to me like the use case that's probably going to be the most.
I mean, so let's take it the other way. Like, when I read John's comment, I'm like, okay, you have 10,000 domains, and if you're behind like a single gateway, that's too big of a blast radius. Maybe we should recommend that if you have that kind of scale, you should have different gateway resources which map to different load balancers, right? Or whatever, however you implement gateway resource, right? To solve for that problem, right? Like, if you have 10,000 domains, and if you are creating, let's say 10 gateways, and each has 1,000 domains, maybe you don't want gateway merging, and you do want separate point of entries, right? So maybe that's another way to look at the problem, right? Like, rather we solve for the configuration part, but when it translates to the infrastructure, it rather creates a new problem.
So I guess, like, isn't that not future-proof? Because it seems like, what if there was a way that after you set up multiple gateway resources, and so basically on the API side, everything that you're describing would be the same, and we are basically saying, well, that guarantees you a certain behavior internally, but it seems a bit not future-proof. Like, what if that could be done, but it's just slightly different, or you could share some resources, but not other resources? That's where I would like to figure out what that merging behavior means specifically, if we're going to say your implementation kind of has to behave a certain way.
So what is the difference between merging a gateway and scheduling a gateway, right? And we've always talked about, okay, you schedule a gateway onto some infrastructure in an abstract way. So how is that actually different? How do we think that merging is different from scheduling? Because I can just say, well, I'm not merging it, I'm just scheduling it onto something which works in this way. So I think this is all very much trying to be overly prescriptive about people's implementations.
So I guess one of the things, looking at the spec for Gateway, I mean, there's only 3 fields in the top level spec for Gateway. There's the Gateway class name, the listeners, and the addresses. I mean, the point that I was trying to make was there doesn't seem to me to be a fundamental difference between merging gateways that have listeners in them and merging a list of listeners. That only applies if the gateways don't have addresses specified as well. You know, like, and I guess that the thing here is about, you know, this comes back to a little bit what James is saying, where it's up to the implementation to be like, do you care about addresses or not? And do you, like, you know, because some implementations don't care about addresses. Like, I know for Contour, like, you know, we specifically do not and will not care about the addresses fields. So we will probably just ignore the addresses fields and say, hey, you know, or if you set one, say, hey, we can't do this. And so, you know, it kind of feels like, and so for Contour, the case of merging gateways is effectively just making there be a nicer way to be able to have to split a big list of listeners up into a set of smaller lists. You know, and that's the thing that's nice for Contour about being able to merge gateways. You know, but that again is because we have properties about addresses where we don't care, where we're not going to do addresses. So I don't know, like it feels to me like the rules about merging gateways come down to the rules about how much you care about, you know, like, can you merge listeners? Like, I mean, there's rules for merging listeners inside a gateway, and are there rules for merging addresses inside a gateway? If there are, then there's no reason why you shouldn't merge, because there's only 3 fields in the top level. Maybe that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, like, I think one of the things, Harry, maybe that you're trying to get at is that there's a sense of isolation, which we would need to define with merging.
Yeah,
Is
maybe
that-
the
is
gateway
that
class can
right?
define that, right? So, I mean, the behavior of merging, maybe it needs to be part of the gateway class resource where it defines how merging is done, if at all.
Yeah, I seem to recall us talking about that before and saying that I think my original expectation was that one of the things that you would get from the status of the gateway class is that the controller that implements the gateway class would write something back to the status of the gateway class saying, hey, I'm taking this gateway class and here's the capabilities or the way that I'm going to treat the gateways in them. And so, you know, so with the intent being that, you know, say, I'm going to merge listeners across gateways and not care about addresses in the case of Contour or something like that. You know, and have some reasonably machine readable way to specify that information on the gateway class, just so that you can have, so that, you know, person or machine readable ways, so that you can, as a person, be like, okay, I assign this gateway class to Contour, say, and then Contour tells me how it's going to treat the gateways. And then that way, you know, if your setup is going to work or not. Something like that.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think the way we should approach, in my opinion, is we should see what use cases are we not solving, and then think about, okay, okay, if we want to allow merging, it's, it's an optional thing in the spec that implementations can do. And then we at least have some guidance around, okay, you can merge gateways, and this is the behavior that users would expect, right? Like, like we're right now trying to solve for a hypothetical case, and to incorporate a hypothetical case into the API, and that's like that seems problematic, right? Like we might be missing things out in the API in that way.
I guess I'm still struggling to understand what problem we're solving by being prescriptive here. What harm would come? I mean, I don't know why we wouldn't just see what implementations do, and then if people have problems, then they, if implementations merge in a way that sucks, then those implementations will suck, and people won't use them, right?
I mean, that's the thing that we should try to avoid, right? Like if we give the community a prescriptive way of, okay, this is what a gateway resource means, and this is how an HTTP route resource means. We would, I think, as API authors, we should try to avoid situations where our API can be abused in ways that we don't expect right now.
But you're
So,
saying,
like,
I think I don't like the word abuse there, because I don't think that being creative with an implementation of an API is necessarily abuse of the API. I think that it's just a different implementation, which maybe it serves some people's needs better than others.
yeah, Harry, though, I have to say there are concrete examples. I know that the APAC, well, this time does work for you guys, but like, I know that AliCloud a couple of years ago had a proposal basically where they had like some fixed number of, not fixed number of load balancers. Each load balancer could only take a certain amount of capacity. And then you could imagine creating a pool of these, and then they wanted to schedule gateways onto that. And you could think of an implementation that basically would schedule mergeable gateways, but then at some point they would run out. But I don't know if necessarily it's something that doesn't have a concrete analog.
I guess so it sounds like the point that James and Bowie are trying to make is, hey, this is an alpha API. We don't necessarily need to decide this right away. Why not see how we go in this version of the alpha, and we can turn up the dial and become more prescriptive if it is a problem. I mean, I think it's a fair question to ask, but also like maybe it's better to get some real world examples by having people actually make implementations and see what it's like.
Yeah, I mean, to me, this sounds like repeating the problem where, so let's take an example today, right? Like not to point fingers at anyone, but the way cloud providers implement ingress resources, they spin up in most cases a load balancer for ingress resource, and the way a lot of proxies do it, they merge ingress resource. Now, when users do go between them, it does create a point of friction, and the users do get confused, and for a variety of reasons. Do we want to solve for the problem, or is it like we expect that that level of implementation is never going to be a part of this API, and that is something we should document, and users should expect these changes could happen.
I guess I didn't follow that or understand why that was a problem for this API. Can you? I'm not sure.
Yeah, sorry, I unmuted the non phone. Actually, we were looking at allowing both behaviors, Harry, like as a gateway class parameter. So some people might be okay with merging. So we would merge stuff that's possible and then instantiate one cloud load balancer, because we've actually heard demand for this. And then the other one would be what you would expect, which is to actually do one per gateway. And in that way, like people can choose this behavior.
Right. So I think I should clarify something. So I'm not against doing merging. What I want to do is like have a better understanding of when do we recommend implementers and users to use merging.
But I think we can't define what merging means. And just like we can't define what scheduling means, because they're implementation specific concepts.
Do you think that we could clarify though, like use cases we anticipate for merging? Like, you know, there's a difference between saying, here are the ways in which you must use merging, and here are some example ways in which you could use merging, which is not an exclusive list.
That's worth having, especially like now I'm thinking, for example, physical load balancer vendors like F5, like forcing a particular behavior for merging would, one of the consequences would be like you only have one gateway that represents that F5, but probably that's not what they want. They probably want more flexibility. You might have one gateway per address or something. Like, we should definitely write down these examples.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess the point that I'm making is that maybe the thing we need to do here is to say, you know, hey, merging is allowed. Merging can mean different things by implementation, but here are some cases of where you would use merging and how the merging would work as examples for people to understand how you could use merging, not how you must use merging.
Exactly. So providing some guidance would help us, I think, in the long run.
Yeah, one thing though is like, I would want our docs to focus on sort of like what behavior the user will see given the contracts that they request in the API versus necessarily digging through how it's actually done. I mean, you do have to walk a line between like people touching the ground, you know, in a concrete implementation. But I just feel like if we start with the merging topics, then it's like, you know, it's like, here's how a car engine works, and then you're like building up to like how to drive a car.
Yeah, but I think that's a good analogy because it feels like, I mean, what we're interested in doing here is driving a car, right? And to drive a car, I don't want to be prescriptive about how the engine works. I just want the car to work like a car.
But Harry, are you looking for implementers? Because I know that we've mentioned previously, like we should have a set of docs that's kind of pitched for implementers versus users. I'm more talking about user docs.
I think this is more geared towards implementers as to when they should offer. Like, it's not exactly saying like you know, as Nick said, like, you know, it's not having an explicit list of, okay, this is the only way you could do gateway merging, but sort of clarifying like, okay, there are good cases for gateway merging, and these are some cases where you could implement this API and do merging. Right? Like we do this for in other parts, right? Like I think there is one thing that we are already almost merging is TLS. Is like, you know, when should you use TLS at the HTTP route level versus the gateway level, right? And there's a reason where, you know, we think, you know, using one or the other will be easier and have a better user experience. So similarly, you know, like having some prescription, I don't know if now is the time for that or after V1 or so.
It seems like at a minimum, what we need for V1 Alpha 1 is we need to be able to say a couple things. One, we need to be able to say that merging is something that controllers can do, that implementations can do, but also we need to clarify that this is not maybe well-defined behavior, or that this is not required of implementations, that implementations do not need to support this kind of merging. It's kind of an optional way that implementations can choose to implement this API. Additional examples of when merging may or may not be appropriate seems like it would be good, but may not be required for V1 Alpha 1. That's my take on this.
Yeah, I probably tend to agree. And the good part is that all of what you said can be summarized in a single RFC style word, may.
Right.
Implementations may merge gateways. That behavior is currently undefined, and we expect sample implementations to help sort of define what it looks like for them in order to make this whole setup more clear, or something like that.
I remain unconvinced that we should say anything, because I think if implementations may do anything, right? So I don't.
But it's
I'm not convinced of the value of saying that implementations may do something, because then of course they may.
But it's important. It's important in terms of defining the spec to say things that you are expecting people that they might do versus things that they should 100% not do. Right? Like, there's a difference between must and should and may and must not. Right? Like and so that's why I'm suggesting the RFC language, because it's pretty clearly defined and clear that if we put the merging as a may, then that is a thing that you can do if you want, that you don't have to do to be a valid controller. But if you do, then there should be, eventually we should put something in there to say, if you do, then here's some of the things that users might expect from you. Like, I think it's reasonable to have in there, for someone who's building a new thing who hasn't been involved in any of this discussion, to have something to say, what does gateway merging even mean? Like, there needs to be something that clarifies the community expectation around what gateway merging is, even if that doesn't define an implementation, like define exactly what the implementation must do. It's at least valid to say, here's what someone who picks this up and has used other service APIs things before, and your gateway says it does gateway merging, this is what they'll expect it to do from a user point of view, not from an implementation point of view, right? Like,
I mean, sure, an implementation should tell you what it does, right? And that's fine.
Yeah. And so the reason to use may is to just have in there that we're not specifically excluding you from doing this, which is what this PR was sort of is the headline of this PR is saying, is we are specifically excluding you from doing this. And the reason to put it in there is to say we are not specifically excluding you. You can do it. That's it.
And I think to add to that, it's important for us as we're continuing to develop the API to understand potential ways the API can be used. And it's important to say, that it's a fairly significant thing to say, yes, you can merge gateways, or no, you can't. So to say, yes, you can is important for other potential API decisions in the future. So I would lean towards explicitly saying that you may do that somewhere, so there's no more confusion around that. But I also want to be very cognizant of our time, and we've spent a lot of time on this. I think we're reaching some kind of consensus, at least for what we need for V1 Alpha 1. And I encourage more discussion here, but because we're short on time, I just want to cover just a few more things before we call this meeting over, if that's okay. So there's a couple more issues here, and I'll get to them briefly, but I wanted to at least mention this. There is a doc. There has been a doc for a while, but I updated it yesterday with the current state of our main branch at that point. And we've gotten some great feedback since then from, I'm not sure how to pronounce that name. And also Tim has also added some feedback closer to the bottom. I know Tim's first reviews had primarily focused on gateway and gateway class, and we're starting to get a lot more feedback from him around routes. I would love to spend some time walking through some of this. There are some smaller things like this, but there are also some larger comments in here as well. But overall, feedback seems positive from what I've seen, but there are some changes that we could make. Some of them are pretty easy. So if anyone wants to knock out a quick PR, there's a number of typos and various things that, yeah, could help. But yeah, I don't have enough time to cover. There's a lot of pages. We've built a pretty large API here, but there's some great feedback here, and just wanted to draw your attention to it. And if you have anyone in your organizations that would be great at giving API reviews, this is a great time. We're not quite at V1 Alpha 1. And so if there's any last minute feedback before we release a V1 Alpha 1, this would be a good time to get it in.
Rob, does it make
Yeah, Rob,
sense for the pieces of feedback that we're going to address in V1 Alpha 1? Does it make sense to maybe create an issue and link it? Where I'm going is like the potential for multiple people to be working on the same thing. And
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So I think some of these are not worth a separate issue. Like a lot of these are typos or, you know, should instead of may kind of things.
yeah,
That I think a lot can be knocked out in one go, but there are some like, I know there's a few that I saw Tim added that are larger discussion pieces that hopefully we can dedicate some meeting time to. But for ones that feel like typos, I think we can knock those all out in a single PR. But I agree, we should triage the larger ones and create some issues for them.
so for those on the call, yeah, if it's not issue worthy, just make a note somewhere saying, you know, that I'm working on it, and
Yeah,
Rob may be in the meantime at the top of the document and kind of red lettering or something to get people's attention to say, you know, please, you know, if it's a major change, please open an issue and link it.
yeah,
Just trying to think through some ideas to prevent
Yeah.
overlap.
that's a great idea. I'll add that above here. Yeah.
Rob,
There's a
did you
comment
ping this
on
out
the
on
listen.
Sig Network mailing list?
I had sent it out previously on the SIG Network mailing list, and I've discussed it on SIG Network meetings. I don't mind sending it out again. Doesn't
Yeah,
hurt.
probably after some of the nits have been taken, we should send it out again.
Yeah. Okay.
There's a comment on the port field of listener status, which is something we definitely need to address.
Yes.
Sorry, scroll back up a little bit, up.
Wait, listener status or
That.
no?
Oh, no,
that
sorry.
should be down.
Yeah, sorry, keep going.
We'll get there eventually. Yeah, there was something like relatively.
Keep going. I'm not sure what Tim
And
means.
gateway
by
is a
what
huge.
you-
Yeah, thank you.
This one. Yeah, so this happened because UDP was added after the fact, and we didn't realize that it would affect the listener status too. So this is a
Yeah.
big problem. This is a problem.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe, yeah, if you want to create a follow-up issue for this one, this definitely needs some more discussion. I agree. Yeah. And thanks to everyone who's already given feedback here. I know we're already past time. But if you have anyone else in your organization or that you know that would give some good feedback here, definitely appreciate it. Cool. I guess if it's okay, we'll move these till tomorrow, these next two issues. And of course, if anyone has time, recommend taking a look. There's a couple things that we could unblock and get moving again. And with that, I think we're past time. So thanks everyone for the discussion. It's been very helpful, and we'll talk to many of you tomorrow.